personal friends, I have William Patterson colleagues, and I have a huge posse from St. Michael's Episcopal Church. So thank you all for coming. Some of you, I did speak last year, it was on Zoom only, about the Burr-Hamilton duel, and that was a lot of fun, and I know some of you were there on Zoom. Today's topic is not quite as sexy as the duel. There's no guns, no violence, and nobody's written The Election of 1800, the musical. So, be that as it may, I will do my best to keep you both enlightened and entertained. Okay, I called this talk, the Election of 1800, our first presidential election crisis. Why did I call this a crisis? First of all, because there was a tie vote in the Electoral College. It's the only time in our history that there's ever been a tie vote in the Electoral College. But the tie vote in and of itself is not what makes this a crisis, because I will explain shortly a little more detail about how the framers of the Constitution set this up. What made it a crisis was that the two candidates who tied were not the two opponents, but the presidential candidate and his vice presidential candidate. That had not, obviously that had never happened before. And the other crisis aspect to it was the time it took to come up with a winner. I'll explain this in detail in a few moments, but essentially what would happen with a tie vote, the election goes into the House of Representatives. But they take a long time to come up with a winner. We'll get into why. But the clock is ticking, because Inauguration Day is scheduled in March, March 4th, 1801. They used to have we're used to them in January, but that's only a fairly recent development. That was after World War II. Prior to that, Inauguration Day was always in March. And it takes the House 2 months. In other words, they get to the beginning of February, middle of February, and they were able to, they come up with a winner. No surprise who that is, because you've never heard of President Aaron Burr, right? So there's no spoiler alert is necessary. Jefferson will win this election. But it takes several months to do that, to come up with Jefferson as the winner. So that's why I call it, it was a crisis, and we'll get into that a little more. So, let me, first of all, as I said, I do want to go 45, 50 minutes max, because I do want to have some Q&A and discussion. But let's just review real quickly how the Electoral College was set up. I know many people still today don't understand it, and it has to be explained every 4 years. But it's in the Constitution, in Article 1. Each elector gets 2 votes, but they did not, in that day, distinguish between president and vice president. If you were an elector, you just got to vote for 2 people, okay? But you didn't distinguish between them. This is going to be part of the problem. Also, the Constitution did not, and does not to this day actually, specify how the electors were chosen. It was left up to the states. And some states did have a popular vote, and did institute that right off the bat, but other states did not. They used the state legislature itself would pick who their electors were. Okay. There were no, the winner. Who wins in a presidential election? The person with the numerical majority, which is not the same thing as a plurality. Plurality means the guy with the most votes. But the Constitution specifies it must be a majority, and they're using that in its strict mathematical meaning, the whole number above 50%. Right? If that person gets that number, You know, today it's what, 270? Yeah, okay, then it was 70, as we will see. Okay, and if there is no winner, the election goes into the House of Representatives. And that's only happened twice, one in 1800 when you had a tie vote, and then in 1824, where you had 4 candidates kind of splitting the electoral votes among the 4, and no one got a numerical majority. But those are the only 2 times in our history when the election went into the House. Okay, also, just a reminder, there were no term limits on president, how many times the president could serve. That was not instituted till, I had to look it up, okay? 22nd Amendment, 1947, that now limits a president to 2 terms. But prior to that, again, with the sole exception of Franklin Roosevelt, and that's why that amendment was put in after he died, so that wouldn't happen again. It did. There were reasons for it, as you know, World War II and so on, but it did make people uneasy. But prior to that, prior to FDR, the 2-term limit was merely a tradition set by George Washington. It was not a law, and it was not in the Constitution. Okay. It's kind of important to remember that as well. Okay. So, mostly the framers of the Constitution did it well in setting up the Electoral College. Oh, did I explain? I hope people know this, but if not, what determines how many electoral votes a state gets? It's their combined congressional representation. In other words, how many House members they have, plus 2 for the 2 senators. So, we'll be looking at New York State particularly. They had 12 in this time period. They had 12 electoral votes. That meant they had 10 congressmen plus 2 senators. So that's how that vote was arrived at. So it is, well, every state gets 2 electoral votes and 1 House representative. The numbers go up there. It's based on population. Okay. There were a couple of glitches in the system that the framers of the Constitution did not anticipate. But we will see them, come into play. One thing, they did not anticipate that political parties would form so quickly, and that candidates would begin to align themselves with these party labels and run as a representative of that party. This happens really right off the bat after the Constitution is ratified. But they did, the men who wrote it didn't anticipate that would happen. What they thought would happen, especially looking at a presidential election, what they thought would happen was that there would be a number of candidates who would run as private individuals. In other words, not as members of a particular party. They would just run based on name recognition and their experience and resume and so on. But it was not anticipated that they would run under party labels. Again, another glitch, each elector gets 2 votes. But they could vote for whomever they wanted to. This is going to be, but here's the problem, and we'll see this with 1800. There was no way, an elector in his own mind might be thinking, I'm voting for this guy for president and this guy for vice president, but there was no official way to indicate that. You had to vote for 2 people, but there was no way to distinguish constitutionally between were you voting for this one for president and this one for vice president. Okay? So we're going to see, obviously, these little glitches in the system will create some problems. What's also interesting is that because of the presence of George Washington as our first president, the glitches in the system aren't, just going to top a note up here. The glitches aren't apparent right away. George Washington, they knew this already, anybody could have figured this out. As long as he was willing, everybody assumed, well, he's obviously going to be our first president. Okay? There was no contest there. And he agreed to do it, so George Washington serves 2 terms. He's elected in 1789, and if you're curious, why is it an odd numbered year? It's really 1788 postponed, because it took longer to get the ratification that and set up the whole mechanism for elections, not just on the presidential election, but House as well. And Senate, I'll mention them, just a reminder, that doesn't really figure into our talk today, but just to jog people's memories. U.S. senators were not elected by popular vote. They were chosen by their state legislature. Okay? And that didn't change till 1913, direct election of senators. Okay? But anyway, a whole new government has to get set up, election has to be organized, and it's kind of put off what was originally supposed to be a 1788 presidential election. It gets put off into 1789. So that's why you have that odd kind of, George has a 3-year term instead of a 4-year term. But anyway, George Washington was our only president who was elected unanimously in the Electoral College. It sort of set off a free-for-all, though, for vice president. Electors could vote for anybody they wanted, and there were a number of names got votes, but John Adams got the largest vote and became the vice president. Okay, so let's look at 1796 then, because in some respects, 1800 is going to be a rematch. If you want to think of it like an athletic event or 2 boxers going for a championship or something, we're going to have 1796 and then the rematch in 1800. But it's worth looking at 1796 for a few moments to see that some of the problems that now become apparent, because 1796, well, it's our 3rd presidential election. It's very important because it's our first contested presidential election, right? Because nobody's going to run against George Washington. It's just not going to happen. And again, with no term limits, George Washington, he could have been president for life if he wanted to, because as long as he wanted to run, no one would run against him. But he does not. He's 2 terms and he's had it. And one can understand why. So this sets off a kind of interesting chain of events. An election scheduled for November 1796. In the summer of 1796, Washington himself starts to give some hints that maybe he won't run again. So of course the rumor mill takes over immediately, but interesting that the rumors could be traced back to George himself. But he makes it official on September 17th, 1796, that he is not going to run again. He's going to retire to Mount Vernon. So we've got a little bit less than 2 months before an election will be held. But of course his announcement immediately sets off a scramble for position amongst candidates who are interested in running. So let's look at what we have before we get to the election itself, which is going to be Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. All right, what's the country looking like politically then? We have 16 states, okay? The original 13 plus 3 new ones, which are Vermont and Kentucky and Tennessee. Okay? The total electoral votes, this is here on the chart. Total electoral votes, 138. Okay? What do you need to win? Outright, 70. Okay? That's the magic number. And you know, if there had been TV in those days, they'd be showing you the map and saying, what's the path to 70? Okay, 9 states out of 16 do use popular vote, and I have them listed here. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The other states, the other 7, use the state legislature to pick their electors. So that means, obviously, the party that controls the state legislature will control that state's electoral votes, because obviously they'll pick people from their own party to be electors. Okay? So that's how it's going to work. As I say, one of the problems, though, is the Electoral College has no way to distinguish, or the electors have no way to distinguish between who's going to get their vote for president or vice president. That now becomes apparent that that's a problem. But nobody's quite sure what to do about it. But the obvious solution is some electors would have to drop a few votes and turn in a blank ballot, which you could do, so that there would not be a tie. It doesn't work. We'll see that. It doesn't work. Okay, but 1796, we do already have parties in place, and they have informal tickets, even though, again, I stress constitutionally there's no way to indicate that. John Adams' running mate is a Federalist politician from South Carolina named Thomas Pinckney. The Pinckneys are a very prominent family in South Carolina, Federalists. And Thomas Jefferson's running mate is going to be, in 1796, going to be Aaron Burr from New York. How does Burr figure into this? He's a Jersey boy, okay, born and raised in New Jersey, but in his adult career as a lawyer and politician, he was based in New York City, and so was, represented New York State. This is it. Yeah, I'm doing okay on time. This is interesting. I'll just tell you a little story about this. In 1791, okay, Jefferson and his best pal / protege, fellow Virginian, whom he wants to succeed him one day, is James Madison. Madison, however, has many more contacts in the North. Jefferson's power base politically is essentially Virginia, right? But Jefferson has presidential ambitions, and interestingly, in May 1791, Madison and Jefferson take a trip to New York State on what they called a botanical expedition. Okay? If you read about that, it's often put in quotes. Because Jefferson's, this amateur scientist and was supposedly interested in all the flora and the fauna of the North. Okay, but why does Madison really bring him on this trip? Is to introduce Jefferson to Democratic Republicans. That's what their party was called. You had the Federalists, and the other party was called the Democratic-Republicans. All right. It's hard to come up with a snappy nickname for them. Some people, the Dem Reps, the DRs. Federalists easy, you just call them the Feds, but Democratic Republicans is a little difficult. Anyway, Madison and Jefferson are DRs. Okay, I'm going to call them DRs. Madison wants Jefferson to meet DRs from the North so he can kind of expand his base. And one of the people Madison introduces Jefferson to, is Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr and James Madison go back a long time, literally till they were teenagers. But in those days, you went to college as a teenager. They were schoolmates at Princeton. Madison 1 year ahead of Burr. But they've known each other a long time. I would say they're not in each other's inner circles, but they've been good. But they know each other well, and they've been good friends for a long time. And in fact, a little bit of lovely romantic trivia. It was Aaron Burr who introduced James Madison to Dolly, a charming young widow, and the gentleman couldn't call on a lady out of the blue. He couldn't show up at her door saying, "Gee, Dolly, I'd really like to meet you." She was a widow, and she lived with her widowed mother in Philadelphia. And Aaron Burr was a senator at that time from New York, and he boarded, the congressmen and senators would board with families. And he boarded with Dolly's mother. And anyway, James Madison grabbed her, as the story goes, on the streets of Philadelphia one day and said, "You got to get me an invitation. I really want to meet Dolly. Give me an invitation." So Burr says, "Yeah, sure." Always wanting to foster romance. So it was Burr who arranged the introduction between James and Dolly. And yeah, it's such a nice little story. had to put that in. Okay. So as I say, Madison, the reason I bring it up, Madison and Burr have a long history of friendship. And it's Madison who introduces Jefferson to Burr. They had, as far as we know, Jefferson and Burr had never met prior to this botanical expedition. And Madison introduces him to other northern DRs as well. Okay, anyway, it turns out in 1796, the two candidates are going to be John Adams and Thomas Jefferson for the presidency. And Adams' running mate, informal running mate, unofficial running mate, is Thomas Pinckney, and Jefferson's informal, unofficial running mate is Aaron Burr. And I'll just add as an aside, it won't surprise you. I'm sure, because vice presidential candidates today, even though it's much more formalized, are basically chosen in a similar way. What do they bring to the ticket? Okay, what do they bring that the presidential candidate doesn't have? What can they compensate for? And this the same thing was done then. Jefferson needs a northerner on the ticket, and that's at that time that was sort of the main Burr's main asset. Although I think he has others as well. I'm afraid to mention Burr's grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, lest I go off in a long tangent about him. But he was the great, America's greatest theologian, Jonathan Edwards, Burr's maternal grandfather. And that combats, today, I'm not seeing any reaction at all. That's okay. But then that would be well known, especially in New England, even though New England's going to go for Adams anyway. But Burr is very popular in New England. And many, many years later, after Jefferson and Adams make up their friendship, Adams said, Burr's going to get so many votes from New England just because of his father, Aaron Burr Sr., who was many years president of Princeton, and his grandfather. And that's a good thing to have on the ticket, because Jefferson is, whether it's accurate or not, I don't know, but Jefferson's reputation then was like agnostic / atheist. He was the guy who literally used a razor blade and cut up the Bible and just picked out the passages he liked and pasted them into a book and called it Jefferson's Bible. Okay, so that is a campaign issue, but Burr compensates for that as well. Anyway, okay, 1796. So I've got a little chart up there. Adams will win that election, but it's very close. Only wins by a 3-vote margin, and 71 to 68. You'll see, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but Burr was very ticked off about it. He only got 30 votes for vice president. So to put that another way, 38 people who 38 electors who cast their ballots for Jefferson did not cast a ballot for Burr. And Burr was very miffed about that. And most of those, 0 votes, you can see from the South. Okay, 1796. The other, just for your reference, John Adams carries all of New England, plus New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Jefferson carries Pennsylvania, and then all the rest of the South and the new Western states. But here's the anomaly with 1796, and again, this is the only time it happened. President and vice president are the two opposing candidates. It would be as though Donald Trump was vice president to Joe Biden. Yeah. Okay. Not going to work. Didn't work then. It was very bizarre. And again, that was something that had not been anticipated. Adams hated it. Jefferson hated it. Nobody liked that outcome in that respect. Okay? But as soon as the dust clears, 1796, and again, we do this today, and people think it's a more modern thing because of TV or social media or whatever. But that as soon as one presidential election's over, canny politicians are already trying to position themselves for 4 years hence. That's not a new phenomenon. That's what they do right here. Jefferson's already looking for a rematch in 1800. And politicians on all levels are trying to kind of position themselves. The DRs, particularly, how can we do this? The strategy. We need to talk about New York State, and I'll try to explain that and keep it not too complicated. But Jefferson's victory in 1800 will hinge on what happens in New York with New York's electoral votes. Okay, New York, as today, was a big electoral prize. If you could carry all New York's votes, they had 12 electoral votes in those days, and that was a good chunk. Only Virginia and Massachusetts had more. Okay. New York is also a state where the state legislature picks the electors. They don't have a popular election there for president. Okay. Burr, who's out of the U.S. Senate and is now actually back in the New York State Assembly, comes up with a plan, and he talks to the other DR party leaders and says, if we can flip New York next time, we will win, and everything more or less stays the same with the other states. We will win and have by a comfortable margin. Okay? But to do that, because there's no popular vote in New York, the DRs have to take the New York State Legislature first. Is everybody with me on that? Yeah. Okay. And they're going to have elections in 1799. So oddly enough, the presidential election of 1800 is going to hinge on the New York State election in 1799. But Burr says, I can do this, and he's got a plan. And I do want to take a few minutes just to mention this, because I think it's very significant, and Burr never gets, I don't know if credit's the right word, credit for this. You know, today, all elections, we just had primary yesterday, but it's always said, it's become a cliche. The person, you know, you can spend, we all know this, right? Millions of dollars, TV ads, okay? And even in ads, I won't mention her name, but a certain candidate who wasn't even opposed had a zillion ads on YouTube. I've been watching YouTube for the Platinum Jubilee stuff. But, so, you know, all these ads, TV and now social media, obviously that all costs money, and we all know candidates spend millions. That's why they have to raise millions, okay? The bulk of it goes to those sorts of things. But it is often said, as I say, it's become a cliche, well, despite all that, the person with the best ground game will win in the end, okay? You've heard that expression?
Yep.
Yep, okay. Aaron Burr essentially invents the ground game. They didn't call it that, but he invents it. And many of his techniques are still used today. It's just they do it with computers. But I mention this not only because I think it shows his creativity in thinking about this, that he kind of gets it, you know. But it was revolutionary. Some of the things I'm going to mention, they seem so simple or common sense, but campaigning was still thought of as ungentlemanly. Okay? Gentlemen did not go out and ask the hoi polloi to vote for them. It would be considered very undignified. Now that's not to say there was no campaigning, but it was either done through surrogates or newspapers. The newspapers were highly partisan. In fact, that's all they were. You didn't have a newspaper that pretended to neutrality or objectivity. You had Federalist newspapers, you had Democratic Republican newspapers. A lot of the campaigning is fought out with newspaper articles and, you know, charges against your opponent, many of which are made out of whole cloth. And also pamphlets. Pamphlets could be published, 2 or 3 page pamphlets could be published very cheaply. But the notion that candidates themselves would go out and campaign was just still considered beyond the pale. But Burr thinks that's nonsense, and he develops the ground game. And he does it in New York City, and he recruits a team of workers, very committed DR partisans, who hope they will be rewarded with political jobs in the future. That that was what greased the system. It wasn't cash. It was jobs, patronage jobs in the future. Anyway, Burr recruits a number of campaign workers. He divides the city up into sectors, into precincts and wards, and he sends his workers out door to door. This was not done in that day, not done at all. And he also develops, part of the purpose of the visit, find out who's a registered voter, okay, and have they made up their minds yet? If so, for whom? And remember, this is all for the state elections. Or are they maybe on the fence, or maybe they're lukewarm to one party and could be persuaded. He builds up a vast card file of all the registered voters in New York City. Kind of amazing. And he learns who's committed. What do we say today? You have to turn out your base. Burr's going to do that. But first you have to know who the base is. Burr's going to do that. You have to appeal to the swing voters. You have to know who the swing voters are. Burr's going to do that. It's really kind of an incredible thing he does, and it's incredibly effective. And my favorite thing is, he even has his workers make sure, do you need a ride to the polls? Horse and buggy will come and pick you up and take you to the poll, okay? The elderly and the infirm, do they love this? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing. He literally gets the base out. Make sure everybody who needs a ride has a ride. Do you need a babysitter? He'll get you a babysitter, okay? So it's quite a thing. Let me mention also, just as an aside, but just to remind you, there's still, in New York State, well, for all states except New Jersey, only men could vote, only free men. But there were property requirements, and also in New York State, as in several others, including New Jersey at that time, free blacks could vote, okay, as long as they met the property requirement. So it's not, it was not as I don't know, thinking the word's not coming up with one. The requirements were not as stringent as we kind of project back to them. Oh, it's just rich white guys, you know. No, a number of states, not just New York, allowed free blacks to vote as long as they met the property requirement. But it was the same, the property requirement was the same as for white people. So I just mentioned that too. Burr, by the way, is very popular with the free black community, since he's the only one in New York sticking up for their rights, but that's a story for another day. Okay, the Burr's ground game thing, I don't want to, belabor that too long, because we need to get to the tie vote and the crisis. But it works fabulously. The Federalists are caught totally off guard. They thought, he's not doing it. What do we care? He's not doing anything. We'll win easily. Well, guess what? Clean sweep of all the New York City seats, and big majority in the state legislature. And because of that big win in 1799 that put the DRs in power in New York State, Jefferson's going to get those 12 electoral votes in 1800. Okay, let's get to the crisis now. As I mentioned, there is a tie vote. 73 to 73, but that's for Jefferson and Burr. Okay, you can see that on your bottom chart. You'll notice if you look over at the Federalist side of the bottom chart, you'll see the Federalists had better internal party discipline. They did exactly what they were supposed to do, which is have one person drop a vote. Okay, turn in a blank. So that way, their vice presidential candidate is only one vote behind the presidential candidate. Okay, the Democratic Republicans, for reasons that are still unclear, but probably just bad communication, don't do that. Nobody's going to drop a vote for Burr. Somebody should have dropped it so it wound up 73, 72, right? Yeah. But nobody did that. Why was that? It's hard to say. There's a lot of finger pointing and blaming after the fact, as you might imagine. Oh, it wasn't mine. Oh, it was him. No, it was him. He should have done. But you have to be careful, because if you drop too many, Adams could slip in, right? You only have a limited margin there. But none of the DR electors drops a vote for Burr. Possibly this was because he complained too much about how badly he'd done in 1796, and so they want to make it up to him. Nobody wants to be the one who drops the vote. But this created tremendous problems, as you might imagine. As I say, it was not really anticipated that that would happen. Okay, so what happens next? Tie vote. Two guys from the same party. Well, according to the Constitution, the election will go into the House of Representatives. A couple things to say about that. One is that it's not the newly elected House, it's the lame duck House. And Federalists have a majority there. Right? But the other interesting thing, and this is the only time, or only situation, excuse me, within the Constitution, mentioned in the Constitution, where the House of Representatives votes by state rather than individual representatives. Some of you may recall the reason the House was set up in the beginning was to give the populace, the states with larger population, more representation. And so in everything else that they do constitutionally, the elected representatives to the House vote as individuals, okay? But this is the one instance in the Constitution where they are required to vote by state, and each state gets one vote. It's almost like my friend Dan Kuzma will appreciate this, almost like a throwback to the Articles of Confederation, where every state is equal. But that's what's in the Constitution. So every state, when the House convenes, they have to vote by state. To win required only a majority, but that was 9 votes. You had to win 9 states in the House to win this election. Okay? For states that had a mixed party delegation, if it's an odd number, one would usually have the advantage over the other. But there were some states where the delegation was divided, and it was an even number of representatives, and they were politically divided. So their vote didn't count. In effect, they have to submit a blank ballot. Okay? And that's going to be a factor here. So those are the rules. The election goes into the House, lame duck House, each state gets 1 vote. You have to have 9 to win. And again, this is known, the tie vote is known by early, mid-December, and Inauguration Day is scheduled for March 4th. So there's not a huge amount of time here, but the crisis element of it is heightened every time another day goes by, and a winner has not been reached, or nobody's got the 9 votes. Okay? Adams is out of it. Okay, the Federalists are out of it. So, I asked the rhetorical question: what are the Federalists going to do now? The Federalists in the House are faced with, to them, an unpalatable choice of 2 Democratic Republicans and who's the lesser of 2 evils. And they don't all agree on that. So this is what contributes to a crisis atmosphere. The Federalists are going to have to, at some point, they're going to have to choose one or the other of the candidates. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but think in your mind, if you're a Federalist in the House, who are you going to vote for? It's tricky. Some Federalists will support Burr. Federalists will support Burr. And that's not as weird as odd as it sounds, since Burr actually has a reputation, again, use the phrase we use today, he's very good. He can work across the aisle. He has good relations with political opponents. In fact, he prides himself on that his personal relationships with them are good. And this is what made him very effective in the New York legislature. He can get deals done with bipartisan support. So some Federalists in the House genuinely think Burr would be a better candidate for a variety of reasons. Just one name I'll mention because he's famous, but he's not in the House. But also, other politicians are not sitting home twiddling their thumbs. They're lobbying, they're cornering candidates in the corridors, or back in the rooming houses that they all live in, okay? They're bombarding them with mail. These guys in the House, well, of both parties, they are under tremendous pressure. The only thing you can say is, well, they don't have TV cameras following them into the bathroom, but, you know, they're still under a lot of pressure from constituents at home, from others of their own party. They're under a lot of pressure. Okay, so it kind of shakes down like this. From the Federalist point of view, there are some Federalists who genuinely do think Burr is a better candidate, or a better choice. I mentioned, yeah, famous, John Marshall. He's not the Chief Justice yet, but he is the outgoing Secretary of State under John Adams. Marshall is lobbying. He's not in the House, of course, so he has no direct vote, but he's lobbying Federalist friends to vote for Burr. He thinks Burr, he says that he thinks Burr will adhere more faithfully to the Constitution than Jefferson will. Federalists consider Jefferson kind of a wild, radical, loose cannon, and too influenced by the French. And we all know where that would take him. Not to a good, not to a good place in their mind, for sure. Okay, other Federalists will vote for Burr, not because they think he's better or even worse, but they hate Jefferson so much, whereas they don't really hate Burr, that some will do anything to keep Jefferson from getting elected, and if it means voting for Burr, okay, they'll do that. Some Federalists, and here's where it gets very dicey, want to do a deal with Burr. So Burr himself, although he has no role in this, directly, he can't vote for himself. But Burr is also getting lots of pressure, another term we use today, back channels, okay? Federalists are reaching out to Burr. We would vote for you, or our state delegation might vote for you, but you have to promise us something. That, for instance, you will not fire all the Federalist office holders. Just remember, there's no civil service in those days. It was all political patronage. So if a candidate's party lost, all those people, whatever, down to the postmaster, they're all going to lose their jobs and be replaced by people from the other party. So one thing the Federalists would like to get from Aaron Burr is a promise he will fire Federalist office holders. And the other thing they'd like is some kind of hint. And they say, yeah, we understand the pressure you're under, but can you at least give us a little wink, wink, or something that you won't dismantle all the Federalist policies that John Adams has, had held during his presidency. So Federalists, here's the bottom line, and I need to wrap this up because we want some chit chat. The Federalists want to do a deal with Burr, and they would see that he got elected president. But you never heard of President Aaron Burr, did you? Even though I have a T-shirt, I'm not going to put it on. Yes, I have a Burr 1800 T-shirt. Okay. Which I'm very proud of, but I only wear it to the gym. Mind you, I haven't been to the gym in months, but there we go. The election drags on. The initial vote, it goes to 36 ballots, okay? And that takes them about 2 months, right? They finally reach a conclusion, what's the date? February 17th. And inauguration is looming March 4th. I will say that people are getting very antsy. Inauguration day is approaching and we don't have a winner yet. Rumors, there is no violence as it turned out, but I mean, there were rumors that there might be riots. If Jefferson isn't elected, the Democratic, Republican rank and file are going to go nuts, and there are fears that there will be riots. There are fears that Virginia is threatening to send its militia into Washington, D.C. If Burr's elected, they will forcibly remove him. So all kinds of threats, some of which were credible and some of which were pretty wacky, but you can imagine how the rumor mill is working overtime, and people are getting very nervous about this. What's going to happen? Okay, let me wrap this up, and then I want to go to Q&A. As I say, 35 ballots yield the same result. Jefferson 8 votes, Burr 6 votes, 2 abstaining because they cannot agree. Right? And it remains that way. There is no movement. It remains, I mean, there's lots going on behind the scenes, but there's no movement in the ballots. It goes to ballot 35, same result. Jefferson 8, Burr 6, 2 abstaining. Finally, Jefferson is elected on the 36th ballot, and as I said, that's February 17th, okay? With inauguration only 3 weeks away. All right, what happened? Basically, the Federalists who wanted to do a deal with Burr finally give up. He's not amenable to any sort of deal, which I think stands him in good stead. And later, not at the time, but later, Jefferson will be, when Jefferson turns against Burr, Jefferson will claim he tried to cheat me out of my rightful victory. But there's, I'm going to go out, not on that limb. I'm going to say there's zero evidence of that. And here's why I say this. If Burr had been amenable to a deal with the Federalists, we would have had President Allen Burr.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I mean, there's your, you want proof. There's your proof right there. And they give him like 35 chances. Will you do a deal with us? And he says no, and he issues a statement through a surrogate that he will not, that he is not trying to overthrow the election or the will of the people, and so on. So finally, the 36th ballot, Jefferson got 10 votes. Burr got 4, and 2 abstained. Although there were some switches. The 2 who had previously abstained, Delaware and South Carolina, now vote for Jefferson, and 2 states that had supported Burr now abstain. So you had 10 for Jefferson, 4 for Burr, and 2 abstentions. So the crisis is resolved, but at the last minute. Postscript is, to prevent something like this from happening again, the 12th Amendment is ratified in 1804 that provides for president and vice president running together on the same ticket, and the elector votes for the ticket for both people, not each person individually. Yeah. So that problem has never occurred again. Again, we still don't know what, you know, who should have dropped their vote on the DR side and didn't. And there are all sorts of, you know, conspiracy theories about that. Burr claimed himself he had arranged with the Rhode Island delegation to drop 1 vote, but of course the DRs didn't take Rhode Island. The Federalists took Rhode Island, so that plan came to naught. And as I say, there's a lot of finger pointing afterwards. My own view is I think it was just one of those kind of human nature snafus and just mixed up communication or unclear signals or whatever. Anyway, that's how it finally ends, and we did have President Jefferson. I'm happy to open it up.
Yeah. I have read where some historians think that maybe the election of 1800 was the most significant election in American history because you had a peaceful transference of power.
Right.
We are the great democratic experiment in the world, and we were a relatively new nation, and that might have been a significant event in world history.
Oh, definitely, and I'm glad you brought that up because I did not mention that at all, but you're quite correct. There is a lot of good that comes out of 1800 election, and one of the things you're absolutely right, that it does prove is that there is, because it's the first election, if 1796 was the first contested election, 1800 is the first election where power switches from the party in power, and they lose, and it goes to the opposition party now becomes the party in power. And yes, that despite all the rumors and fears of riots and whatnot, when it comes, Jefferson is the winner, and yes, you're absolutely right. The inauguration day is quiet and peaceful, even though the Adamses leave in a fit of pique, but there's no violence or no no charges. Once it's over, it's over, and I think Burr deserves some little bit of credit for that too, for not making it drag on longer or sort of saying yes, Jefferson's the presidential candidate, he's the winner. and I'm with him on that. So, yeah, but that's a great point. It is the first peaceful transfer of power. Thank you all so much.